Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. So who am I? I'm Joe Desimone. I work for Endgame. I'm a security researcher there, technically malware researcher. I like to do development, I like to do hunting, and I like to reverse engineer stuff, and my Twitter handle at @des_. So what is this talk about today? So this is about hunting in memory. So everyone knows, fileless, kind of like this umbrella term. This is about the actual in-memory attacks, things that don't touch disk. This isn't really about scripting-based attacks, about PowerShell attacks and stuff like that. Although they're kind of related. But I'm going to talk about why hunting for these type of in-memory threats is important. I'm going to talk a little bit about memory-based attacker techniques. I'm really not going to go into detail. Hey, what's up? I gave a talk earlier this year about at actual SANS threat hunting and IR. I gave a talk that really went into detail about some of the actual malware techniques with Jared, actually. And I'm not going to go to that level because it's only a quick 20-25 minute talk. But I'll give a little bit of an overview. And then I'm kind of going to go into my two-stage hunting methodology and defensive strategy. And it's really broken into two different categories for defending and detecting it against in-memory threats. And that's going to be the eventing or the real-time data approach, and then there's going to be the on-demand post-breach approach. And they're both, two different ways of looking at a problem, and I think if you really want to have a good defense against it, then you have to do both. And then I'm going to release and demo, well, not really demo, but I'll show you guys two tools for actually hunting for .NET in-memory type attacks. Okay, so quick, why memory hunting is important. I mean, it's kind of like beating a dead horse now. You can open up tons of blogs and APT type reporting, and you'll see that at least at some point they'll be using some type of in-memory attack. Now, I don't like to say that an attack is totally fileless, but really what it comes down to is, as a defender, you think, you have to be perfect because you can't let them in ever. But if you go from the mindset of, they might get in, all you need to do is detect at one point in their entire, attacker lifecycle before they get to their objective, then it doesn't matter if they're totally fileless, but if you're looking at this point in the kill chain, then you can make that detection and stop them from getting to their objective. So even if they're not totally fileless, the fact that at some point they might have a piece of malware that does something that is fileless, you can use that to your advantage to detect them. So you go back 10 years, this stuff isn't new, it's been around, even Poison Ivy did in-memory type injection. So it's not new, but it's becoming more popular, I think. There's just code. I mean, you can go to GitHub and just download tons of stuff and build it into your tool set. All the public tools like Metasploit, PowerShell Empire, they have, file, in-memory type capabilities. So it's really easy for, not the top tier actors to have these type of techniques. Really comes down to the reason why they're using these techniques is because they're designed to evade personal security products, PSPs, and the hunters, the people in this room, but also the sysadmins, the people that aren't really that security conscious, but they're still, they kind of have to take on that burden too. But really, it's a great signal-noise ratio because if you can look for these type of techniques, then there's you're going to have false positives on any type of detection technique, but there's a lot less if you're looking at stuff in memory. So you can really kind of find the bad stuff quickly. And it's sort of if you do it right, it can be easy button hunting to find red teams and actual adversaries in your network. Okay, so common attacker techniques, I kind of broke these down. Everyone loves buckets. So kind of one bucket would be the unbacked executable code or floating code. So think classic shellcode injection like Poison Ivy. Basically what it comes down to is you have code, some plus X, executable section that's not associated with an image on disk. So basically not mem image. These are what I would all classify as floating code. And that includes reflective DLL injection, memory module, some process hollowing, it just depends, and even gargoyle ROP style techniques at some point will have floating code executing typically. So that's kind of one bucket, and you would approach that to detect that kind of in its own way. The next bucket is overwritten executable code. So, there's nothing really stopping an adversary from just loading some image that they're not actually going to use in a process and just overwriting it with what they want. So this is Flame use this technique, Corrado use this technique. I don't really see it much in the red team type tool sets or crimeware all the time. But the way you would basically go about detecting that is you can sort of compare what's on disk versus what's in memory. That's kind of the beauty of being like a hunter with an active system. Like you can tell, hey, this is what's on disk. Does it match what's in memory? Is the MZ header even the same? It's a really easy way to detect if they're just overwriting the entire thing. The next bucket would be, I'll focus on this later in the talk, but Dotnet Reflection, and kind of because it's associated with deserialization. So we don't see this like a ton, but .NET style attacks are becoming more popular. I think, PowerShell is super awesome and huge, and all the security improvements on PowerShell, and everyone, knows about it now and knows how to hunt for PowerShell attacks. And now there's kind of these new like .NET attacks that are coming out that can evade a lot of the security tools. But if you really want to know more about, sort of these attacker techniques like in detail, I wrote a blog post from my talk earlier this year. You can go read that. A coworker, Ashkan, he wrote an awesome blog. It was basically 10 process injection techniques, and he went through one by one, really in-depth stuff. So, if you're not totally following, like you can go back to those, read those blogs, and then maybe come back to this talk, and some of it will make more sense. I just kind of threw this on there. The APIs of shame, basically, like what are all the APIs that you need in order to do a cross-process injection? Does anyone know of any other? So sometimes you use a handful of these APIs in order to do your injection, but typically you need at least one. Does anyone know of other APIs without this list to do a cross-process injection that I could add, maybe?
Atom bombing.
So atom bombing uses QUser APC, but that's a good one. But, okay. So maybe there's more out there. I was just kind of brainstorming. I think knowing like what APIs the attackers are using is really helpful to know how do you defend against those type of techniques. All right, so I'm going to start with kind of the post-breach on-demand type of detection. So Jared Atkinson released a PowerShell script called Get Injected Threads, and basically what that does is on a system, once code is already loaded into memory and is unbacked, you can, after the fact, you can query all the running threads, and the kernel actually keeps track of the start address of those threads. There's ways that it can change, but a lot of times it'll still work. And you can see, even after that thread is started, you can retrieve from the kernel, hey, where did this thread actually start? And if it started in a location that's not backed by a file on disk, that's really anomalous. That's definitely something you want to look at. Next would be like call stack analysis. So this is a lot more complicated. I'm not really going to go into details or release code for it today, but it's really helpful because there's ways to evade the start address detection, but it's much more difficult, I think, to evade the call stack type of analysis. So you can look for things on the stack that are unbacked. You can also look for ROP, sort of like what EMET does when it's, inline detecting some of these critical APIs. You can just use the same type of technique and then just look across the system in order to detect things that are injected. And then sort of like the memory scanning approach. So if you think, I don't know if people have used like volatility, but kind of like the really easy button method is just malfind with volatility looks for like RWX sections that have like an MZ header right at the start. So that'll detect like reflective DL loading. It'll detect memory module type stuff. Definitely do not rely on read write execute. Really what you want to look for is at least one +X section that's associated with a chunk of memory. So, the start of that like chunk of memory could be read or read write with the actual MZ header, but as long as there's an attached with a similar allocation base that's +X, then you'll be interested in that. So look for, any unbacked sections that are +X. You can look for MZ headers at the start, but it's becoming a lot more common that people just wipe the header. So I'm just going to leave it up to kind of the audience to come up with fuzzy ways of detecting if a PE is there. We kind of have some tricks in our product, but I think that's kind of an open problem for people to solve, to try to not rely on the header at all and determine, hey, what about a PE file, can you use in order to identify that even after the header has been wiped? And then I'm going to talk about Git CLR Reflection, which will do sort of an on-demand PowerShell approach for detecting some type of .NET CLR type attack. So basically the way this works, I'm using Matt Graber's PS Reflect under the hood. But first, actually, I think I got a little ahead of myself. So .NET Reflection itself, what the heck is that? Well, there's basically a built-in way to the .NET language or to the common language runtime that you can basically
do sort of a memory module technique, a sort of, reflective DL injection, so to speak, you can basically call this API, this function, and just give it an entire DLL, and it just maps it into memory for you perfectly. It's totally fileless, it doesn't touch disk, and it's completely built into language. It's used legitimately, but it's also used for a lot of malicious reasons. And it's very popular for attackers for this reason. Once again, it's built in, so it's really easy to use. It's great for packers and obfuscation. So, if you have kind of like a nested doll where things are unpacking and it's just, decrypting something and then sending it to this function, then you'll see that quite a bit. It's great for staged payloads, so you can have a really small kind of payload on disk or in the registry somewhere, and you want to load in, the second stage over the network or from wherever. All you have to do is just call this API. You shove it your module, and you're fileless, and you're loaded right in as a .NET process. It's great. It's also great for bypassing device guard, which we'll kind of get into more, because it doesn't actually validate. It's not aware of device guard that's even a thing. It basically doesn't know to sort of query the kernel and say, am I allowed to load this? It just says, oh, you want to load this? Sure, why not? So there's some implications there for device guard even. And just some examples. So PowerShell Empire, when you do an injection, we do like a PS PowerPick style injection where you want to migrate from one process to another with PowerShell. It'll actually bootstrap the PowerShell runtime in that remote process, and while it's doing that, it'll call this API. .NET to JS, this was kind of like a bonus. So XML, or the binary formatter API, surprisingly enough, calls a similar API under the hood. It doesn't directly call assembly.load, but it'll eventually call a similar function, so that's kind of related. And Mad Hatter, that was just an implant. CrowdStrike actually talked about that in their blog. It looked pretty cool. And then, universal.js and the other stuff use .NET to JS, so they're all sort of associated here. Okay, so this script that we're going to release, get CLR Reflections, how does it work? So like I said a little bit earlier, PS Reflect by Matt Graber, it uses to interact with the Win32 API. It's kind of like a nice little library for you to use. And basically it's pretty simple actually. It sort of just looks for the memory traits of that CLR, that .NET CLR module when it's loaded without a file backing. So if you actually open up with Process Hacker after you've done this, you can find it by just looking for mem-map sections that have the read-write protection, only read-write. So note, it doesn't have +X. So if you're looking for that, you won't find these. The MZP header will be at the start of that section, and it's not backed by a file. So it's mem-mapped, but when they actually call the create file mapping, they're basically passing null as the file path. So if you're looking at it in Process Hacker, you just won't see a file path there. And that's all kind of important. So basically, we just look for those criteria in PowerShell. So we're scanning through all the processes on the system, and we look for that set of criteria, and it'll basically find those sort of .NET memory module or .NET reflection loaded modules. And I'm not great with PowerShell, so it's pretty simple. It'll dump out the module for you to sort of do your analysis. Fuzzy stacking will help a lot. So the problem is, legitimately, when this is called, basically the hash is going to change every time. So you kind of have to get a little bit creative with the way that you bucket and stack these as you're doing your hunting. What I kind of came up with was this notion of a type ref hash, which is kind of basically you take, everyone's heard of import hashing, where you basically hash all the APIs for a standard function. Well, you can sort of do that with .NET. You just parse sort of the type refs, which is basically what functions is it importing, just hash those. And then you can sort of bucket your things into that. And you'll see some false positives, there's some benign applications will load resources. So they'll just load a resource file in memory. It's actually an execute, it has a full header. But if you dump it into some .NET parsing application, you'll see there's no actual code in there at all. There's zero type refs, so your type ref hash is basically going to be, the hash of 0. So that's just something to keep in mind. I didn't want to write my .NET parsing in PowerShell, so I just gave a little flag for the other project, CLR guard. You just do -F, and it'll dump out a bunch of stuff for you, so you can sort of chain those together. This is just kind of an example of running it. So, you just call get CLR reflection verbose, and it'll loop through every process. And if there's any hits, it'll give you the PID, the memory region that's associated with that, and then it'll save it out to disk. So, yeah, it's really pretty basic, but I think it'd be cool to do this, since it's PowerShell, it's not going to really crash your machine or anything like this. You could probably go wild with this on a network and look for some type of .NET malware and use this as part of your hunt process. Okay, so that was basically the hunting post-breach type approach. But now we're going to talk about eventing sources. So it's important to look for these type of in-memory threats from a hunting methodology, but also it's very useful, and it's kind of a complementary approach to do this from eventing sources. So there's already been some great talks with ETW at this conference. There's a couple ETW providers that directly apply here, but the one built into the kernel is basically, there's callbacks built into the kernel. So if you have a driver, which kind of sucks, but you can become inline anytime there's a process being created. The kernel will tell your driver, hey, there's this new thread being created. And you can basically look and say, like, hey, is this backed by a file or not? So it'd be like the same type of detection, but it would be real time. You could potentially block it. This is probably what every AV company has, some sort of thing in there that does this. Even Sysmon will log when it does that create process, unbacked, it'll tell you that this is actually happening. So that's pretty cool. But as far as ETW goes, these are new for Windows 10 only. So there's a Microsoft Windows kernel audit API call, super mouthful. So that basically, the one thing that I saw for that was set thread context. There's some other. What? Sure, I'll take this mirror off. So. So it'll log stuff like terminate process, I think. It'll log open process, but really for process injection, set thread context is the good one. And since there's no kernel callback for that directly, this is a good way to kind of get that as a bonus. So Windows 10 only, unfortunately, for that one. Microsoft Windows Threat Intelligence is kind of a hot off the press. It doesn't even exist on my long-term service branch VM, but on the previous creators update, it'll have it. And on the newest fall creators update, they're even adding more stuff to that. So that's a great eventing source if you can kind of get access. And then also CLR guard, which I'm going to release. So this actually will event on the assembly.load call. So if you call assembly.load, this will actually event on that, and it'll basically log it. You can block stuff inline. It's pretty cool. But real quick, so Microsoft Windows Threat Intelligence, you basically, you dump the information on this provider, and you're like, holy crap, this has everything I could possibly need. We had that list earlier of all the APIs, everything's in here. So you're thinking this is going to be the best thing ever. I'm going to use this and be able to attack every type of process injection so easily, but really not so much. So while it does fill in gaps for, the process injection, it kind of does think that it's ETW because, you'll get a 1 second delay with ETW, which is kind of an eternity. When you actually get that callback, if there's malware being injected around, it might not be there in a second. It might have died. It might have moved somewhere else. It's a big pain to not have it in line. The other major problem is that only Microsoft can actually access it right now. So if you try to call enable trace on, or if you're just using Logman, you'll just get access denied, and you're just like, what the heck? So I just kind of dug into, I followed opened up DLLs, opened up the kernel and IDA, and just followed it down until I got to this function, ETWP check security logger access. And basically what it's doing is it's checking who's trying to enable this provider, and it checks to make sure that they're a protected process. Which, okay, yeah, I kind of can get that, but it's checking to see if the signer is Windows. So the only way you can actually enable this is if you have a signer level Windows. It's higher than the anti-malware level, which is 3. So yeah, you're kind of SOL. There's no way to access this. And I think part of the reason why I did this was to try to protect that provider, so you can't tamper with someone else's unless you're Windows. But the fact that you can't enable it if you're even anti-malware level protected process, that just really sucks. But there was a way to get access to it, so I kind of did the YOLO, and I just dumped all the PPL, all the protected processes on my box. I found this one security health service, happened to be running as protection level 51. That was the magic protection level I needed. Or you could use MSSense, which is Defender ATP. I don't have that running on my box, so I couldn't use that. But I used Xenos, which is an open source kernel mode injector, and I used the memory module option because there's some. Basically, there's some validation on whether or not your actually a Microsoft DLL when your DLL is getting loaded, so you need the memory module option. But I just injected in the security health service with like an ETW logger DLL, and boom, I was getting events from these providers. So definitely not a production level solution, but there are ways to do it. There's probably some other ways besides this, but yeah. All right, so now CLR guard, what the heck is that? This was so the idea is, how do we instrument and hook the CLR to monitor and block for suspicious reflection events? And the first thing was like, where the heck do I hook? And the great thing about .NET and the CLR is all open source, so you can just literally go to GitHub, and Microsoft has posted all this code. So I kind of just started at reflection assembly.load, the actual managed function, and I followed that down until I got into the actual core CLR native code. And eventually there's this function called load image. It's like the native equivalent. So basically this function will get called anytime that you try to load a module through reflection. So basically I created a DLL. It's called CLR Hook. I just, as a proof of concept, I'm just using app init DLL, so it gets loaded into anything that loads CLR, or, well, technically user 32, but it'll get loaded into every .NET process on the box, and it'll hook this function. And then when these are called, it'll actually it'll send this over a name pipe to like a watchdog process, and then the watchdog process can look at that whole module as it's being loaded and be like, hey, do I want to allow this to happen, or do I want to say block this action? So right now there's a very simple whitelist. In order to keep, like, you can't whitelist off of hashes, like, because every time that you're loading something, it's going to be a different hash. So I use that type ref fuzzy hashing in order to sort of do this. This is probably not the most secure way of doing it. It's probably better to do like an authentic code style, like, hash as much as possible. It's not going to change across things, but this will just kind of as like just to get people thinking about other ways of doing like a fuzzy hashing, a fuzzy whitelisting approach. So I'll show you guys a little GIF of this running. So I'm actually running this against universal.js by Subt, and basically what's happening under the hood is he's using .NET to JS, which under the hood uses the binary formatter deserialization. And I actually didn't know that this was going to work, but that function actually under the hood calls this load image function. So I'm getting these events as they're coming in, and I can basically check it against my whitelist and say, hey, do I want this to load? And no, I have no idea. I've never seen this DLL. I'm just going to, block it. And then, the process will just terminate itself, basically. So that's pretty cool. There was another little quick demo here. This is against Matt Graber. He's kind of like this forever day device guard bypass that Microsoft is not going to service, because they really don't have a way of instrumenting, like, they don't really have a way of doing this without kind of being hackerman like I am, hooking inline. And basically the key of the issue is that he can, with a race condition, he's able to basically wait for like add types where it's happening from an actual signed script. And he's able to insert his own code over top of it and basically, bypass PowerShell constrained language mode and get access to that. But under the hood, again, since this is just loading using the load image function, we're able to instrument this. We're able to detect that it's happening. And kind of like what I'm showing on the screen too. Anytime you call add type in PowerShell, you're going to have like a load image function happening. So that's why I'm sitting there running a bunch of them, and you can see there's a whole bunch of, so fp.bat, you can see I'm just importing PowerShell diagnostics, which has an add type in there, and you can see they're kind of flooding in. All the hashes are changing, but the type ref hash is the same. So you can whitelist just based on that type ref hash. But when you actually run the exploit code, if you're trying to import more things, or if it looks different enough from the standard thing you're whitelisting, then you can detect that and block it. So, let's see. Conclusion, I think the important takeaway is that in order to detect in-memory threats, a post-breach and an eventing type approach, they're complementary, and it's kind of like looking at a problem from two different ways, and it's the best way to be secure. Get CLR Reflection and CLR Guard will help you defend against some of these things. So, I mean, it's not perfect. It's proof of concept. I wrote it in a weekend, so I'm sure there's ways to bypass, but I think giving it out to the community will help people look at it and come up with better ways of improving it, breaking it, doing all that. So that's what I would love to have some recommendations and improvements coming in from people. I haven't pushed it yet to GitHub, but that's the URL where you'll be able to find it here shortly. And I think I have a little bit of time for questions, couple of minutes. So does anyone have any questions? Yeah, so that's a good question. Do you have to know that there's a breach in order to hunt for this stuff? Absolutely not. I think if you're in a SOC or if you're, on a security team, this would just be part of your daily grind of automating this, looking for this stuff, looking for outliers, kind of understanding your network. And it's just, you build that into your process, and you kind of have to assume that you're breached. You just go in the assumption today, hey, we got owned. Even though you don't know that, you just go in that mindset, like, if we were and we didn't get any alerts from our products, how would we find them? And that's the hunt methodology. And that's how, you kind of raise your defensive posture to the next level, I think. But great question. Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at anything for Mac OS at all, or have you been primarily focused on Windows?
Have I looked at anything for Mac? No, not at all. I'm kind of a Windows guy. I had a crossroads, so in our product, we're working on Mac stuff, and it was like, hey, do you want to go work on Mac stuff? And I was like, kind of a Windows nerd, so it's probably best. But there's a lot of other research, like Patrick Wardle does awesome stuff with Mac, so definitely go check out all his stuff. I'm just not the guy for that, sorry. Yep.
Can you go back one slide?
Oh, I'll tweet this out too, so yeah.
The gist is private still.
Okay, you can't pull it up?
I can probably directly, I just didn't want to type that in.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, yeah. Oh, one more.
Yeah, just something worth noting. Because you're hooking the native load image, you're also capturing all of the various assembly load overload methods, and there's 5 or 6 of them.
Okay.
There's a few in the assembly class, but also in the app domain class. There's some static methods in there, so that's cool that you'll be able to capture all of those.
Awesome. Yeah, another, I would say, pleasant surprise, because hey, let's see what this actually catches, and it turns out to catch a bunch of stuff. But thank you. Okay, I think that's probably all I have time for. So thanks for coming.